Hello, and thank you for joining us on another episode of the CUFI Weekly. No doubt the story dominating the news cycles is the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and the situation that's happening there. So, to get a greater insight into what is happening, to understand the wider global implications of this, and how it really factors into the areas that CUFI focuses on, which is primarily Israel and the Middle East, I had a conversation with CUFI's Action Fund's Director of Public Policy and Strategy, Boris Zilberman. Here is that conversation.
So to talk about the situation in the Ukraine, I have the CUFI Action Fund's Director of Policy and Strategy, Boris Zilberman. Thanks for joining us today, Boris.
Thanks, Kasim. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking about the situation in Russia, the Ukraine. So I guess for our viewers, the first question would be, why did Russia invade the Ukraine? And how did we get to this point, essentially?
Okay, I think that's a good question because it's not often that large-scale war breaks out in Europe. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has been in power since 2000. He's a revisionist leader looking to create a kind of greater Russia once more. He's long spoken about, to quote unquote, the tragedy of the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is not the first time he's taken military action. We saw him back in 2008 invade the country of Georgia. In 2014, they invaded Crimea, which is part of Ukraine and parts of eastern Ukraine. And so he's not been shy about acting on his vision. And so post 2014, Ukraine understandably turned further west under the Russian threat and having parts of their country annexed by the Russians. And ultimately, it looks like Putin has wanted to expand west. I don't think this was a spur of the moment decision. This is something that kind of slides in with everything he's been saying and wanting.
So I guess my follow-up question would be, CUFI is a one-issue organization. We focus on Israel. So how does a war in Eastern Europe impact the Middle East, if it does at all?
It does because of the players. Russia is a key player in the Middle East. For worse, since 2015, a year after their invasion of the first invasion of Ukraine, they jumped kind of whole hog into Syria to prop up Assad. After the U.S., the Obama administration decided not to kind of act on their words of the Assad must go. Putin saw an opportunity. Historically, during Soviet times, Russia had a lot of influence in the Middle East. Again, part of that recreating greater Russia and Russian influence that they had during kind of peak times, whether the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, we saw them go into the Middle East, deploy into Syria in large numbers. And that has ramifications. That has ramifications primarily, most certainly for the Syrian people, but then for the Israelis, who then are de facto dealing with a Russian statelet of sorts on their border.
Right. So that leads well into my next question. So what message does this send to Iran? You touched on the Iranian entrenchment in Syria, but the invasion, the Western response, the US response, what message does this send to Iran right now?
Well, I think from a U.S. perspective, we're sending a very bad message because we're continuing. I think people don't realize that we're currently negotiating with Iranians for another deal of sorts. We, the United States, are not directly negotiating. We are actually negotiating with the Russians, who the Russians are de facto emissary with the Iranians, which is at this point is ludicrous before the invasion, and now it's kind of bordering insanity, where we are using the Russians as they're shelling civilian residential areas of Ukraine and invading. We're using the Russians to negotiate what by all reports seems like it's going to be a pretty poor deal if it comes to fruition. It begs the question of what are we doing? The Iranians see the Russians use force, and the Iranians are also have ambitions beyond its borders, just like the Russians. They do so through terrorism, through different types of coercion. And what they want is a nuclear weapon so they can use nuclear coercion. And it's a lot harder to deal with states like we're seeing with the Russians, who obviously have a large number of nuclear weapons, who want to be expansionists, who want to use their force against their neighbors. Iran falls into that category of wanting to do those things.
Right. Well, Boris, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for really unpacking a lot of what's going on and how it impacts both Israel and the United States. We'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Kasim. Appreciate it.
I really hope that conversation was beneficial and gave you a deeper insight into the global repercussions of what is happening right now in the Ukraine. I ask that you keep the people of the Ukraine in your prayers at this very tragic and difficult time. And until next week, this is Kasim Hafiz for the CUFI Weekly. For Zion's sake, do not remain silent. Thanks for checking out today's episode of CUFI Weekly. If you enjoyed this episode and want to stay up to date with the latest news from the Middle East along with topics involving US-Israel relations, please be sure to like and subscribe. And remember to click that notification button so that you are notified every time a new show is uploaded.